Although not as popular as they historically have been, compact cars remain an important part of the market, especially as consumers shift more attention toward affordability amid the economic disruption of COVID-19. So we took the longtime Cars.com favorite Honda Civic sedan, this has been around for a number of years now, this 2020 model, and compared it to a couple new 2020s, the Nissan Sentra, just redesigned, as well as the Toyota Corolla sedan, also redesigned.
Well, typically when we do comparisons like this, we have so many models that we just do the high points and low points of each model. But because this is such a nice tight trio, in this case we're just going to run through the various judging categories and just compare the three and explain to people how they did. But it bears noting first that there are a lot of similarities among these cars. I think that the contest was a pretty close one because these are all in their own way pretty strong in the market. And just jumping into one of the most important things that people think about, which is powertrain, one of our judging categories, they're pretty similar. 3 4-cylinder engines, 2.0 liters except for the Civic, which was a 1.5 liter with the only turbocharger in the test. They all have CVT, continuously variable transmissions, which are not our favorite, but they're here to stay. They all give pretty good fuel economy. They all have EPA estimated combined mileage ratings in the low mid 30s, pretty close to each other, and they all have different drivetrain modes, like sport modes, that are pretty well executed. They help you get more power out of the powertrain. But there were some differences. You want to comment on some of them?
Sure. It's worth noting that these are all essentially fully loaded versions of the car, very close to it. The Civic and the Corolla both have their optional engines, so there are lower powered engines you can get. The Sentra just comes with one engine. It's a 2-liter engine. But I absolutely agree with you, Joe. I mean, there's similarities in large part between the way the three of them kind of accelerate, but there are some differences too. One thing in particular that jumped out for me on the Civic was kind of the way it delivers its power. It's got this bit of old school turbo lag, especially when you get on the gas from a stop. And the CVT kind of rescues it when you're already in motion and need more power. There's a pretty good kind of stepped sensation of a fake downshift, which most CVTs are now trying to do, and the Civic does a pretty good job of that. But right off the line, there's just almost nothing in that first half second or so, and that's definitely not something we're experiencing in the other two.
You stomp on it from a stop and almost nothing happens. But I agree, once you get going, it evens out and it's better. I didn't have too much trouble with the Sentra, except one time when I was accelerating from a stop uphill, it felt like it could use a little more power. Overall, the Corolla, though, felt a little more powerful than the others, just in general, not overwhelmingly powerful. I think they're all adequate, certainly.
Yeah, the Corolla actually has a different transmission. It's got a fixed ratio first gear that kind of then hands off to the pulleys after that. And what that means for your average shopper is that when you start out, there's kind of that feeling of linearity. You don't get what we call the rubber band feeling, where there's a feeling when you push the gas pedal that the engine isn't quite keeping up with what you're doing. And in the Corolla, because they've got that real first gear, you don't get that sensation starting off, and that makes a whole ton of difference in that car compared back to back with these other two.
It's good that these are all pretty modern executions of CVTs, and most drivers won't even notice, so that's good. But we should go on to one of the areas of greatest distinction among these cars, and that is, I guess, 2 categories: ride and handling.
Well, the one that stuck out to me the most was the Civic. The Civic certainly has the quickest steering ratio. It just feels the most nimble. You really get into a corner, whether you're coming into a long sweeper or coming out, and there's just very little push or front heaviness to the kind of the feeling of the balance of the car. There's very limited body roll. It's just a car that you could take cloverleaf probably 4, 5, 6 miles an hour faster than in either of these other two. But on the flip side, ride quality is definitely not great in the Civic. The shock absorption over kind of sewer covers and ruts and stuff is fine, and there's a degree of polish to it, but the isolation, and that's really where we talk about, you kind of get on these roads with broken pavement and maybe some undulating surfaces, and the Civic is just bouncing and going up and down and up and down. Neither of these other two cars are doing that.
I agree. I think the thing with the Civic that's amazing is it handles so well. It corners almost perfectly flat. The front to rear balance is amazing for a front wheel drive car, and the turning is a quicker ratio, quick turn in, and it really kind of, I think, reflects that there are two other versions of the Civic, the Civic Si and the Type R, that are so much more sporty and more capable, and you can tell from this car that it's capable of more, and those weren't feelings I got from the other two. And in particular, I was surprised because the Corolla sedan, I was kind of given higher expectations because the Corolla hatchback came out in 2019, and I found it much more fun to drive, much better handling, and there are some differences, shorter wheelbase and some other things. I had higher expectations, was a little bit disappointed to find that this one, even though it has better body control than the Sentra, which tends to just, you know, in a corner, it'll just pitch over and stay there, and it tends to be a little bit sloppy. It was still felt heavy and kind of numb in the corners. But we should also mention that the two on the outside here, the Civic and the Corolla, had 18-inch wheels, which tends to give a firmer ride, all other things being equal, whereas the Sentra comes with 16-inch wheels standard and was optioned up to 17s. I thought the ride quality on the Sentra was great. I found it extremely comfortable, but there's no question there was a trade-off in the handling.
Yeah, the Sentra really kind of butters its bread on that side. I mean, it's very clear when you get into it. The isolation and the damping are both certainly softer and more composed than these other two cars, although I thought the isolation in the Corolla and in the Sentra were kind of in similar fields with each other. Definitely a world apart from the Civic. I didn't think as poorly about the way the Corolla handled as you did, perhaps, but I do agree the Sentra definitely was both the softest and the clumsiest.
Yeah, and this is something for people to consider if they're shopping, like what are you looking for? And it really does bear emphasizing for the Civic. The ride quality, I think you mentioned it does well over potholes and stuff like that. What I think we're saying is that it's sophisticated suspension. It does a nice job of controlling the car, obviously, or it wouldn't handle well. This is about firmness. This is just about how it's tuned and the size of the wheels and stuff like that. And I think that's something that people need to realize if they drive the car, that this is not just the only option you have in a small car.
Yeah.
Why don't we go into interior comfort, because that also is one of the things we judged, starting with the front seats, comfort and roominess. How about how you felt about where the distinctions were there?
Well, I know you and I had some minor disagreement here. I think we both agreed that the Civic's front seats were generally good overall.
Very good overall.
Honda tends to have pretty good seating support, kind of the geometry of how the head restraints and the bolsters and all that work out. And that's no different in the Civic. Now you do sit a little bit lower, maybe an inch or so lower than in the other two cars. You and I both like to sit with the seat raised all the way, and Honda tends not to have a seat that goes as high as I would like it, perhaps the same for you.
Yeah.
But overall, hard to complain too much about kind of the comfort levels up front there. The Corolla we disagreed with, so why don't you start there?
Well, I think one of the problems I had with the Corolla is, even though I give it a lot of credit for having more adjustments than, say, the Sentra. For one thing, the bottom cushion has that tilt adjustment, which I think can be critical for some people. The Sentra didn't have it, but it did have power lumbar, which the Civic didn't have. It's pick your poison here. But I just found the seats in the Corolla overstuffed. Not as supportive. The side bolsters were too big. I just frankly didn't find it as comfortable. And as I did either of these two, and for what it's worth, we did score the Civic the highest overall for its adjustments, roominess, comfort, and such. To me, I still thought that the Sentra was second, just because I found the seats, even without that cushion adjustment, more just supportive for a long haul drive. I liked it better.
Well, I didn't think the seats on the Corolla were overstuffed. For me, the bolsters seemed about appropriate in terms of lateral support. And I gave it a lot of points for having excessive adjustability. I mean, from where I could sit, I could continue to move the seat back like a couple more inches, and that's not something I got in either of these cars. So especially for taller drivers, you're gonna have some more adjustability there. One thing that for me, where I sit, I tend to sit high and a little bit close. For me, there's a kind of big bulkhead in the Civic on the left side of the center console that just keeps ramming into my knee, and it's really uncomfortable. And so that's potentially a deal breaker for seating comfort from where I sit. But again, we're trying to evaluate these cars relative to how you
different
listeners,
shoppers.
different shoppers are going to
Right.
care about it. And so in that regard, if you don't sit as close as I do, then you're probably not going to have that issue with the knees.
Yeah.
Another thing about the Sentra, I thought I was sitting on the seats rather than in them. They're very flat. They're a little bit big, but there wasn't enough lateral support for me. And so I was just moving back and forth a ton, and especially in the corners, I just didn't feel like the seat was supportive that much at all. It also didn't have hardly any rearward adjustment range, and so...
So it doesn't support you in the corners that the car is not really equipped to take in the first place. is what we're
Indeed.
saying. Okay,
Yes.
so I think we've got that one settled. Since we're in the front seats, let's move on to another important category we judge from the front seat, which is visibility, outward visibility. And I'll just go right ahead with the thing that hit me the most, which was in the Sentra, you mentioned we both like to sit high. I'm looking right at the inside rear view mirror. It is literally blocking my view, and it doesn't go any higher. So the forward view, I graded it way down for. Whereas to the rear, it has relatively low rear head restraints on the back seat, low trunk line versus in the Civic, and very high obstructive head restraints in the back seat of the Corolla. So it's really kind of a mixed bag in what we're dealing with. And that's the kind of thing people need to look at if they're trying these cars out. And also always try and move the mirror up. I get in cars that my colleagues have driven and find the mirror like way down here, and those things can be moved up, not just left, right, and stuff like that.
Yeah, they're typically just two ball joints with a thing in between.
With a connecting rod between them.
As you had mentioned, it wasn't just the mirror for me. I mean, in the Sentra, because you kind of sit a little bit higher, it's a bit of a higher riding car, the whole windshield just seems kind of low. The roof line really comes into my field of view in a way it didn't in either the Corolla or the Civic. One thing we talk about with forward visibility is kind of where those mirrors are placed. You got some cars that separate the mirrors now off the A-pillars, so you get a little more visibility with thinner pillars, and the Corolla did that. Probably more common, especially in this class, are going to be mirrors that are just kind of attached to the pillars, and that's what the Civic and the Sentra did. But overall, I agree with you.
Why don't we take a step into the back seat, which is actually one of the other areas of greater distinction among the three. Was there a shining star here?
Yeah, it was the Civic. The Civic had more leg room, more knee clearance out ahead of you, at least another inch or so versus either of these other two cars. And that's a big difference. I mean, because you're talking about kind of a back seat that's a little bit more snug for taller adults especially versus one that's maybe more workable. And that's the difference between being able to, pick up some in-laws at the airport or having them complain more than they usually would because they've got to visit you.
Yeah.
But in the back seat, in the Civic, I thought, it was kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul. The seat sat a little bit lower. I wish the seat was a little higher off the ground. My knees were dangling in the air a little bit, but because of that headroom,
your knees were kind of like raised by the higher floor.
Correct.
Which means you're sitting on your tailbone, and that's a trick that automakers use to give you more headroom. And everyone's like, "Wow, look at the headroom." What they don't realize is, 20 minutes
squatting.
of a trip, your feet fall asleep.
Yeah. So I mean, the Civic was doing that a little bit, and there was significantly more headroom, I thought, in the Civic than in either of these two other cars. But in both of these other cars, the seat sat higher. So.
Yeah, I actually initially, because there's more legroom in the Civic, I was like, wow, this ain't bad. But I realized it's because my legs were way out in front of me. If you had a comparable amount of space, like if you had people seated there and you had the seat moved back, that would end up kind of scrunching your legs up and raising your knees. Since we're on the topic though, as is often the case, in our car seat check, where our certified child safety seat technicians put different types of child seats, or car seats as parents call them, into the car to see how the car accommodates the seats, the extra space in the Civic gave it an advantage. So it got the highest score of the three in the car seat check as well.
Interior quality is one of these battlegrounds in terms of just the look and feel of things, not just surfaces you're touching and things you're looking at, but really how well do these kind of controls, the gear shifter, the turn signals, the wiper stalks, how well do those feel? Do they feel meticulously engineered or do they not? And I'll just start right there. That was kind of one of the big differentiators. I actually thought in terms of overall materials quality, aside from the seats, which can always change depending on the trim level, overall materials quality was actually pretty similar between the three cars, where the biggest difference was with those controls. I thought the Civic had very meticulously engineered controls, especially things like the climate dials and the way the gear shifter worked. You got over to the Corolla, and the center controls were fine, but things like the gear selector, things like the turn signals,
Yep.
those things just felt like they were going to fall off.
Yep, very much so. They felt cheap to me, and I thought that the Sentra was also fine in that regard. And as it regards interior quality, it goes beyond that, and also to the detriment in my scoring of the Corolla. I didn't like the upholstery as much. I didn't like the use of the blue stripes in the upholstery. I didn't think the material was very appealing, especially compared with the light tan in the Sentra. I didn't like the blue accent stitching. It was real stitching, real thread, which is nice because in some cases, you'll see, I think it's in the Civic, you'll see it like molded into the urethane, so it's fake stitching, but even so, it didn't work for me. And overall, I had a much lower opinion of the interior quality of the Corolla.
It's worth noting that the Corolla and the Civic are virtually the same price. The Sentra is actually a few $1,000s less.
Yes, it
and
is. As we tested them, as equipped.
As equipped. And for that, in the Corolla, you get vinyl upholstery that's very clearly vinyl. I mean, you know, we talk about vinyl, sometimes people get in, oh, this is like leather, it's leatherette or whatever.
Right.
No one's gonna think that about the Corolla's vinyl. And you actually get over to the Civic, the Civic's got pretty nice leather. I mean,
Yeah.
it's covering almost the whole seating surface. We couldn't detect any real obvious kind of stretches of vinyl. I mean, it's pretty nice in the Civic. The Sentra's got this kind of butternut color, and that always kind of makes it seem a little nicer. It's got kind of a quilted
That's true.
pattern.
We have to be careful not to be swayed, which it definitely works on me. So I try to adjust my read on it.
But overall, certainly, colors aside, two nicer grades of upholstery. Similar money, definitely a worse grade in the Corolla.
So one of our biggest and very broad categories is user interface, which includes all means of interacting with the vehicle, from shifters and stalks to the multimedia touchscreen, not the multimedia, options.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning that manufacturers tend to screw up a lot of things about the usability of their cars, particularly when you get up to luxury brands. And so it's nice that all these cars are pretty straightforward. Even the car that we kind of judged had the worst usability, the Civic, it's missing a tuning knob, for example. So,
right.
if you're just trying to get to a station on the radio, you have to like press the touchscreen a whole bunch of times. The other cars have no surprises there. Nothing really too much to complain about.
Right, and they all have real buttons instead of capacitive buttons, but I did notice some differences worth, scoring slightly differently, like the buttons and knobs were bigger in the Sentra than they were in the other two, and I believe
particularly the Corolla.
They were smallest in the Corolla,
Yes.
so, a little bit less there. The menus, aside from the size of the screen, the menus in the Civic are just a little bit old school, and so there were aspects like that. I found I had to change the way the instrument panel displayed in the Corolla, just because it was hiding the speedometer behind the top of the steering wheel, and so I had to go to the analog view. It's just little things like that. It's all about usability, but by and large, simple to use cars. Then there's the issue of multimedia like sources, like Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. And we marked the Corolla down a lot. I certainly did, because I'm an Android Auto user, for not having Android Auto. It is a feature that's become indispensable to a lot of people, like CarPlay. Toyota has finally started adding it to many of its models, but not this one. So that was a downer. On the flip side, the Corolla does have as equipped in our form, it has a wireless charging pad for your smartphone. But honestly, it was not very reliable working with my bulky smartphone case. So it was there, but it kind of wasn't there. It didn't knock me out.
Part of that's because it just sits under this shelf that really intrudes upon space. We'll get to space inside in a second, but yeah, I mean, I knocked it down a lot as well for not having Android Auto. It did have a navigation system, so did the Civic, but
That's right.
I mean, this is how important...
And the Sentra didn't have its own built-in navigation system.
Right, but this is how important Android Auto and Apple CarPlay are now, that those navigation systems incorporated from your phone are generally just so much better than any onboard navigation system that I basically didn't give credit to either of these two cars for having a nav system, because it's a feature that's so like 2010.
I gave it a little bit of credit, especially in this case, because I have an Android Auto phone, or an Android phone, and there was no Android Auto, so how could I not? The other aspects we look at are things like USB ports, especially for charging your devices, which are so important. And in that regard, I was a little disappointed that the Civic has only 2 ports in front, and neither of them are really charging ports. One is clearly labeled 1 amp, and the other is 1.5 amps, and that's not really enough. You need 2 or more amps, as the back seat of the Sentra has. It has 3 ports total, including 1 dedicated to charging in the back. The Corolla has 1 data port and 1 charging port in the front. So these are the things that play into it. These seem, to someone who's a car guy, this probably seems pretty petty, but when you're a normal person, you find that fighting over charging ports is a real thing in your life.
Oh yeah.
Now, for anyone keeping score, we did check cargo, the trunks of all 3, and did our own testing and measuring to make sure, and found that they are so close that it really doesn't bear further mention. But we did find pretty big differences on the inside, the in-cabin storage.
Straight up, the Civic would embarrass a lot of SUVs. I mean, it's got this multi-tiered kind of trough under your armrest here that opens up this sliding bin underneath the cup holders, which you can slide back as they're on rails. There's another tray that's also on a separate set of rails, and then there's a little divider that you can take out. A lot of parts to lose, as you had mentioned, potentially, but really a ton of overall storage, and it continues. There's a lot of storage in the doors, there's storage in the back seat doors, there's just a lot of kind of nooks and crannies to stash your stuff. The Sentra wasn't bad. I mean, it had a really big compartment under the center armrest, and it kind of had some trays and stuff available to drivers as well. The Corolla really had kind of a dearth of really good storage.
Yeah, I think the problem that the Corolla had, aside from having a really small center console under the center armrest in front, was just pretty ineffective door pockets, especially for storing bottles and stuff like that. And I got to give a little bit of credit to the Sentra's just big open bin. I mean, I was knocked out by that until I got in the Civic. I'm actually kind of getting tired of the sliding, moving parts that can come out and get lost. I think there are 2 minds on that particular approach to things, but you cannot deny that there's just a lot of volume in there, and it's very usable. One thing I want to point out, because we talk about cup holders, is I found that, at least in the Sentra, in the back seat, the flip-down armrest, the 2 cup holders are separate enough that they're both usable at the same time. Some of these things in the center armrest in the back seat, they look like a Venn diagram, and I'm like, oh yeah, you look at that and you go, look, 2 cup holders, and then if you ever try to put 2 cups in there, like especially if they're fast food cups or a big coffee cup, no, you're not really putting 2 cups in there at the same time.
The cups that we use now in modern day America.
That's right,
yeah.
As big as possible.
Mm-hmm. So another important category we look at is safety. Obviously, results matter more than formula, and results here would be Insurance Institute for Highway Safety crash tests. But unfortunately, we don't have a full set of data that's been published by the Institute for all 3 cars, particularly the Sentra. It's missing some of those test results. And so we look at kind of a rundown of features. Pretty similar overall. Both cars have automatic emergency braking and collision warning over kind of a wide spectrum of vehicle speeds. The differentiators were a couple things. The Sentra has rear automatic braking, so when you're backing up to 7-8 miles an hour, it'll actually potentially be able to detect something behind you and stop the car. Neither of these other 2 cars had it. And the Corolla had swiveling adaptive headlights, an option here on our test car.
Yeah, and in addition to the rear automatic braking, the Sentra has rear cross-traffic detection. So if you're backing out of a blind spot in a parking garage or a parking lot and a car comes towards you, it'll warn you that something's coming. And not only do other cars not have it, they don't offer it at this point.
Yes, the Corolla will offer it for 2021, we should mention, but the Civic doesn't offer it. The Civic doesn't even offer blind spot warning system, so it's a little bit old school on that. And safety is one of those things often where the car most recently redesigned will have the most equipment. The Civic goes back to kind of middle of the last decade, and so that's unsurprising.
And that's probably why the Sentra is the only one, I think, currently to offer on the higher trim level than we had a 360-degree camera system, but we did not have that in ours.
A related category is kind of driver assist features. A lot of people call them self-driving features, a misnomer, but we can get into that in another time. So these cars, it's really amazing how far we've come. I mean, if you went back 4 or 5 years ago, these cars would have had basically nothing.
Right.
And the Corolla now has lane centering steering. It works all the way to a stop and works in concert with its adaptive cruise control. You had some issues with kind of beeping from how all of those worked, but the feature is there, and that's not a feature offered in either of these other two cars. The Civic has lane centering, but it only works north of 35, 40 miles an hour.
Right, and honestly, I was really impressed with how well the lane centering worked in the Corolla, along with the adaptive cruise control, which I should mention the Sentra also had.
All three of them
Actually,
have.
all three of them had. But I was irritated by the beeping, because what happened is every time the Corolla would lose its view of the lane markings, it would beep. And this is just a very conservative way of applying these technologies that some manufacturers do and some don't. Toyota does it this way, I think Subaru does it this way. It can be really irritating to the point that people will turn it off. And if people turn it off, then what they paid for or what they were hoping to use ends up not being used. I think they need to rethink that kind of thing. I checked to see if there was a way to disable that, change the view on the instrument panel, whatever. I was not able to find it. So I wasn't wild about that, but just the fact that you can get it in a car of this price in this class was pretty impressive. Value is a big one, and considering that the Sentra was several $1,000s cheaper than the other two, I would have expected it to run away with it, the contest. But we also look at how all the vehicles are equipped and what they give you, and it was actually pretty close. The Sentra did come in first in that category, but the Civic was pretty close behind, which is interesting. It's kind of a trend we've been seeing for a while in our challenges with many vehicles in the same class competing with each other, is that Honda is not that premium priced brand necessarily that people view it as, that it used to be.
So we added up all the categories between judges' subjective scores and some of our measured testing, things like driver assist and safety and cargo, and that got us to our final scores, bearing in mind that we gave double weighting, as we customarily do, to value, because it's a very important category to consumers. When the dust settled, the Civic had eked out a narrow win over the Sentra, with the Corolla bringing up a not so distant but definitely decided third place. You can check out plenty more about this challenge on Cars.com/news.